Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this conference. My name is Guillermo Quijas. I'm the editor of this trilogy. The Futuro is a female by Lisa Yaszek. I thank her very much for her presence here in Spain, and Marta Fernández and Miguel A Delgado for accompanying us in this presentation, and also Fundación Telefónica for the venue. Almadía is a Mexican publisher that was born in Oaxaca in 2005. We have around 400 works, 400 books published, and we opened a few years ago a subsidiary in Spain, and we have around 30 books published in these 3 years. And this project that we have published one title at a time. In the first year we published Mundos Alternos, Alternative Worlds. Last year we published Retrofuturismo, or Retro Futures, and this year Dystopic Futures, Futuros Distópicos. So it is a project that is really very exciting, whatever approach you have. It is a beautiful project that has been welcomed in Latin America, in Mexico, and also here in Spain. Lisa will talk about this more in detail, but it is an anthology that she published in a single book that was published in the US a few years ago, and we decided to break it into 3 different books from a thematic point of view in order to give it a different life, a new life. So that's what I wanted to tell you. I invite you to enjoy this conversation, to come closer to these books, and I'm sure that you are going to be surprised by these books as we were. So thank you very much, and I turn the floor over to the round table.
Gracias, Guillermo.
Thank you very much, Guillermo. Thank you for your words, and thank you for bringing these wonderful works. We are here because the future is a female, is a woman, which is true, but that's also the title of these 3 books. As Guillermo was saying, it's 3 different books that are available for you in the Antonio Machado bookstore, and you should buy them because you are going to enjoy them a lot. These 3 books prove something else, not only that the future is female, but also that the past was female as well. And we discovered that these authors were successful in a very masculine environment. Not only that, they reinvented science fiction. They modeled science fiction. They gave it a deeper power, and they made science fiction what it is today. That's why we are here, to talk about these pioneers in science fiction with someone who is a pioneer in science fiction research, because Lisa Yaszek has been researching for 20 years about all these authors, and she's covered all these in these 3 books since the 20s, since the 1920s until present time. And she's an academic. She works in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication in Georgia Tech. She's one of the people who know most about science fiction in the world, and this is since she was a kid, because at her family they used to love reading science fiction, something she shares with Miguel A Delgado, who's also a great reader of science fiction. He's one of the people I know that knows more about science fiction in Spain, so I think that's something that you both have in common. You know Miguel Ángel very well because he's worked here as a curator for many exhibitions. Since Tesla or Verne, Houdini, he discovered color for us. He talked also about other pioneers in dancing, for example. I really recommend his works in Tesla and his last essay as well. Miguel Ángel, we had so much fun reading these 3 books.
Buenas tardes.
Well, good afternoon, and first of all, thank you, Lisa, for these books, for this discovery, and thank you for bringing them to us and to the publisher. And for me, it's been a huge discovery because precisely you mentioned Star Trek. In one of the series, Deep Space Nine, there is a chapter where Captain Sisko and its crew travel to the past, and they appear in the New York, I think it is of the 1940s or something like that, and by these things that normally happen in Star Trek that have no explanation, they go to the newsrooms of one of those magazines, and there's a profile where you could perhaps recognize Isaac Asimov and so on. So what is striking about that is that there is an author, a female author, and an African-American male author, and the problem is that the editor decides that in the next issue the stories should incorporate the photograph of the authors, and they encounter the problem that both the Afro-American author and also the female writer tell them that they have to take a male name because the readers otherwise will discover that she is a woman. And so when you read Lisa's book, you will discover that that is the greatest fantasy in Star Trek, because that was not the case. That didn't happen that way. Am I right, Lisa?
Sí, pues
well, it's been that discovery, the discovery of the authors that will be mentioned, but above all these myths that you point out, Lisa, and that you discuss in the book, and that I believe that not even those like me that love science fiction so much knew about them. And it's a very important role that you have played, and I think it was a discovery also for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a discovery for me. I was originally hired at Georgia Tech to teach science fiction, and my first class was a history of science fiction course. And I knew I wanted to teach something different than the usual lineup, because I knew my students would know the great names like Asimov and Clarke. And so I decided to go look at old anthologies. We have a really large science fiction collection at Georgia Tech. We're one of the top 20 collections in the world. So I thought, well, I'm going to go look at the old anthologies and see what people were actually reading. And my first assumption was that I'd find more male authors. But I thought, great, maybe I'll find some male authors I don't know. What I was shocked was that I found a lot of women, and that the editors and other authors were really excited about their work and their contributions to science fiction. And that opened up a whole new world of both reading and research for me.
Hablaba Miguel Ángel además de que en
Miguel Ángel was saying also how in that episode in Star Trek they were telling women that they should use their nicknames so nobody would know that they were women, but that was not true. That's what you tell in one of the books. They were using these nicknames because of another reason, because they wanted to hide that in their daily life, right?
Yes, so first of all, most women never used pseudonyms. They wrote under their own names. And in the early magazines, they had their pictures posted with the stories, so it would have been very clear. And when people did mistake the sex of some women with ambiguous names, other readers would correct them. So it was really well known within the community from the very beginning. So the few women who did use pseudonyms tend to be some of the most famous of the authors, and I think that's why we assume all women authors did it. But for the most case, it was really maybe 3 or 4 women, and each of them had a very specific reason outside the science fiction community to change their names. So, for instance, C.L. Moore, Catherine Moore, she worked at a bank during the Great Depression, and in America, if employers at that time found out you had another job, especially if you were a woman, they would use that as an excuse to fire you. So you don't make any money writing science fiction, so people have to keep their day jobs. And it was a similar story about James Tiptree later in the 60s and 70s. Some of you might know her. Her real name was Alice Sheldon, and she was a CIA agent and a psychologist. So she was used to being spooky and hiding things already, and she wanted to keep her science fiction writing separate from her scientific career. In the 50s and 60s, authors were often encouraged to do that if they had those two different kinds of work. So once again, she just chose this name. And for a while, everyone always knew C.L. Moore was a woman. That was no surprise to anyone in the community. But James Tiptree, for about 4 or 5 years, people did think was a man. But eventually, fans are very excited about science fiction, and they tracked her down and found out who she was. And I think fans still do that kind of thing today.
Miguel Ángel, como fan por alusiones.
De hecho,
Yes, in fact, the fact that there were also male authors that took a female pseudonym, so the other way around. So for someone like you, it has been a challenge, I guess, to be able to determine the identity lying behind every signature.
And in fact, started first doing this research, we would just make lists of the people we assumed were male, the people we assumed were female, and the people we couldn't figure out. Fortunately, with digital technologies, and fans are so good about putting everything online, we were able to find out the sex of most of the authors that we were looking at. And one of the things we discovered was that in the 1950s, when domestic science fiction became really popular, a kind of storytelling that was invented by women and associated with women, that men would use female pseudonyms so that they could publish that kind of fiction. So, yeah, probably more men were using pseudonyms than women.
A mí me interesa mucho la ciencia ficción doméstica.
That's interesting, that domestic science fiction, that home science fiction, which appears in one of the episodes, Judith Merrill, one of the stories in this book, because she takes science fiction into the suburbs, and she opens like this new branch in science fiction, but she does something else which is important for the world of literature. She does to science fiction what John Cheevers does to his literature, bringing into the suburbs, which was important in that time in the U.S.
Right. And I think that was so smart of women in the science fiction community at this time. And a few men. Ray Bradbury also sets stories in suburbs, often on Mars, but they're still suburbs. And in a moment when women were being asked to leave the workforce and return home for the good of the country, this became a really important way for women to do two things. One, to sort of push back against that, and so you could tell dystopian stories about all the terrible things that will happen if you don't let women back into the workforce. And Judith Merrill wrote quite a few stories like that, for sure. But also, it became a way to invite people to think about how we build the future in a lot of different parts of our lives. And the reality is, most of us do not experience the future either through visits to laboratories or through work on launch pads. Most of us meet the future in our homes. We meet it through simple things like running water and plumbing, both of which radically transformed women's lives. Women went from chopping wood and carrying water 17 hours a day to working a much more manageable kind of workload in the home with these new technologies. And of course, even today this is true. Most of us get what we know about the world through our personal devices, our little screens, right? And through things we have at home, our home computers, even our microwaves are a kind of technology of the future that have changed who does the cooking in the home. So I think even today this remains important. And it's interesting that while women don't write a lot of this science fiction anymore, I think because, with the revival of feminism, women have gone back into the workforce, but as men begin to explore their different options, and some men choose to stay home and become homemakers, we're starting to see men writing this kind of science fiction again, which I find absolutely fascinating.
Sí, la ciencia ficción.
Well, science fiction is a genre that is perfect for to understand the time at which they were written. Through science fiction works, we can have a glimpse of the fears and the concerns of the times. They are like a portrait of that contemporary moment, which is really very trustworthy. But we have in mind science fiction written by men. These female authors that you include move around this genre quite comfortably. They also can do space adventure, even in barbarian types of works or in space operas. But they have a different perspective, a different standpoint. To what extent do these works speak about that society? What do they contribute vis-a-vis what we get from male science fiction in order to understand the societies where they were written?
Well, one thing, of course, is
Bueno, un aspecto es que nos ayudan a entender.
they help us understand, right, well, how women experienced that time period, of course. And I think often they help us understand what it is that maybe men weren't seeing necessarily about their own culture and their future. So it can be, I think, really estranging for people, not just that you would read domestic fiction and say, oh, I get this, it's set in a home, it's like what I'm used to, but it also has a defamiliarizing function, and it can get people to look at those relationships differently.
Lisa, hay algo sobre lo que decía Miguel Ángel que me parece muy interesante.
There's something about what Miguel Ángel was saying which is interesting. Science fiction is like what we see in minds and how we see the structure of the system. We're talking about women with not the same privileges as men in the 50s, for example. And sometimes I feel like we are always concerned about that person who is isolated or marginalized, or when we think about that Martian who is like a second-class citizen, because sometimes women felt like that. So
Yeah, and I think especially in an era when women were being invited to leave the workforce and go into individual homes, and at a moment when the suburbs are exploding and people are moving out of multi-family or at least sort of close groups, either on farms or in cities, and all of a sudden you have people in houses more isolated, and especially for women, as men went into the city to work, women were often at home all day and may not have even had a car to get around on. So, yeah, I would imagine, I think it was, we know from history that it was alienating for a lot of women, and we know that also the women used that as an opportunity to just start to find ways to build community. So how could we build community around creating daycares, for instance? And the first daycares in America were created by women who were stay-at-home moms who wanted the community of other women, but also wanted to have their kids maybe out of the house for a little while around other kids, etc. So, you see this in some of the stories. So all of a sudden, there are stories that take place in daycares. My favorite story is Roselle George Brown's Carpool, which is literally all about a group of women taking their kids to a nursery school and what happens when an alien mom joins the carpool.
En el fondo lo que están diciendo es lo mismo que las autoras feministas de la época, ¿no?
yes, what you're saying is like Betty Freeman in those times, and that story that we also like in Carpool. You see that perfectly well.
I would like to ask Lisa to tell us something that she tells in the book, and I find beautiful. What happened with Judith Mary and the tale about the fact that they're only a mother, or how does she get to the point of writing that tale? Because I think it is quite illustrative of the relationship that they have with the editors and with Campbell, for example, that is like a sacred figure.
To tell that story, and I have a follow-up story that's not in the book, I can tell as well. So what happened was Judith Merrill was a young and up-and-coming author. John Campbell was a well-established editor, and they were at Worldcon together in the mid-40s, and John Campbell was on his usual women can't really write science fiction rampage, which seems odd because he became a science fiction writer at the same time a lot of women did. So, but there you go. So they were drinking, they were young. Let's just give them that credit. And so, and apparently they were very drunk. And so a very drunk John Campbell was going on. And a very drunk Judith Merrill said, well, not only am I going to write you a story, but you're going to buy it, and you're going to buy it without any revisions. And he said, oh, that's cute. I'm sure that's what's going to happen. And she wrote That Only a Mother, and he bought it without revisions, and he asked her for more. So that's really exciting. And then the next thing that happened is she wrote him another story. And this one was set on Mars. It's called Mars Child. Sometimes it's called Sin in Space, too. There's a very spicy cover version of it. And when she gave it to him, he sent it back. He said, I don't want this. Where are the housewives? It's not set in the home. So I think that's really interesting, that once he was convinced women could write science fiction, all he wanted was domestic science fiction. So I don't know if that's exciting or kind of boxing women in, maybe a little of both.
Sí, un poco de encasillamiento. También cuenta Lisa.
Yes, it's like he got stuck with that, right? And with these stories, some of them were very controversial back in the time, like The Conquest of Gola, which is a book by Leslie Effeston in 1931, which is a society that is like utopia. And in that story, what can you tell us about it?
Favorite stories in the whole anthology, and I just taught it. My students like it too, which surprised me because it's very old, but they really like the Golans. So this is a story about, it's told from the perspective of the Queen of Venus at some point in the future, and she's telling the story to her children of how they fended off an invasion from Earth of men. And it's a wonderful story. And it was the first science fiction story published in the modern era that was narrated by a woman, the first science fiction story that was narrated by an alien, and the first science fiction story where humans lose a war to aliens. So, right, so you can see where there was a lot of reasons why people might have found this to be a controversial story. And Stone was a wildly popular author at this point. She was probably in the top 5 of science fiction authors. And she said it was the first time she had written anything that caused that kind of controversy. And she said it was just so funny because, feminism was barely a gleam in women's eyes, but men just got so upset about this story. And her editors loved it. They absolutely fueled the flames of the controversy because it sold copies of the magazine.
Mm-hmm. Pero y yo personalmente...
I personally can understand that controversy, but I have to confess that what was striking for me is that another chapter, like Space Episode by Leslie Perry, was also controversial, but for something which is even more striking, at least seen from our standpoint nowadays.
Oh, the ending of the story, you did? Yes.
Sí, o sea, es como...
Yeah, I recognize that Judith Merrill is not striking that case because of that vision, and she even had both things, not only the men that or the humans are going to invade Venus. I think it's a planet that they are going to invade, although it is known by another name, but society is a female society where men are like more or less, they are like slaves, they are slaves. So it has everything, every component. But that of Leslie Perry, I don't want to really unveil too much, disclose too much, but the ending is really very striking, because you say that it anticipates a role of a heroine that is now quite common and commonplace in science fiction.
I don't know how much we want to talk about the end for people who are going to read it, but I think it's fair to say it's definitely one of the first depictions of women as heroic astronauts, right? As almost like Flash Gordon type of larger-than-life heroes. And I don't want to say anything more because it's so surprising, the role reversal in the story. There's a disaster on the spaceship. It's 2 men and 1 woman, and let's just say the woman deals with it a little better than the men do. I'm not going to say anything else. You can read the rest of the story.
Sí, de hecho, tiene algo.
In fact, some of the authors that are included in that list are the inspiration for the X-Men universe, and there's a tale that really anticipates Alien, the plot of Alien, so the footprint is huge.
Yeah, and what's interesting about those stories is, again, they were often kind of domestic science fiction stories set in classrooms, right? And again, I just think that was drawing attention to another space. We literally are building the future as we educate children, right? And the fact that she's writing about human-alien integration at the moment in the 1950s when we were trying to begin racially integrating schools seems really important. But also, right, she writes about hidden people with special powers, and that really was, we understand, the inspiration for the X-Men, for instance. So that kind of writing about young, powerful children who are marginalized by normal people in society, but who are really the future.
Claro,
So sometimes the children are the future. Oh, that's like a cliche, but it's true.
sí, pero tirando un poco del hilo a esto que...
Yes, about what Miguel Ángel was saying. The different pieces are very different to each other. So we have Gilles Deloy, a heroine in The Black God's Kiss. And she's a heroine. She's like inheriting the Amazons. And we have also the Jonaros stories, and we had the followers of these in the movies, but back in that time, the female effort after the Second World War, it was not weird that we had such powerful women, right, like Wonder Woman.
We're just beginning to get them in the 1940s, and I think that makes sense because we're a couple decades after the first wave of feminism and the suffrage movement, and so I think young people who grew up in the wake of that, then it becomes a little more natural to think about having female heroes. That was certainly true with the man who created Wonder Woman. He was a good feminist, married into a good feminist family, and wanted to create a powerful and strong role model for kids. And he was actually in a menage a trois, and Wonder Woman is based on both of the women he was in a domestic arrangement with, which I think is really fun. So what a nice homage to them as well. And they were both writers, so that's very cool. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say about that one.
Sí, y además...
Besides, it is something that we see very often throughout the 3 books, how the whole vision that we have, not just of science fiction, I think it happens with all genres of the pulp. We could also include the Western novels and black novels. Right now we are at a time where the black novels are very much recognized, but at that point in time they were just for pulp novels for consumption. And several of those female authors just moved around those genres quite comfortably, and Katie Ernest writes black novels, and they have no problem whatsoever to change and to switch from one genre to another. But what is striking is to see that the great majority of them are authors with some with a high level of education. They are college students or graduates. One of them is the daughter of Thomas Mann, so she could not have grown in a more powerful environment. But for them, it is not problem at all to write a specific genre, and in particular science fiction. And that is something that seen from Spain even now is striking, because we still have that distinction between what is academic and what is not academic. But for them, it was no problem at all to write that. It was not a low type of writing.
I do think science fiction was not considered necessarily like high literature or mainstream literature. I think now, especially in the US, they're much more closely aligned. And they start to get aligned in the 60s and 70s with the rise of postmodernism and mainstream writers who are working in more fabulous styles of narrative. So, but yeah, absolutely. That's one thing that really struck me as I was doing the research, is that these were really well-educated, well-traveled, worldly women who were pursuing PhDs in an era when less than 10% of Americans went to college at all. So it's exciting to see them bringing that to the work. But I've also found the science fiction community was craving it. And again, in a time when when most people didn't go to college, a lot of people thought this could be how you could get a scientific and maybe even a sort of civic education, was by reading these stories. And in fact, fans would ask editors to put in italics all of the parts of the story that were based on real science or real social organization, so they could learn from it and distinguish. The editors refused. They said it's a story. You figure it out on your own. But I think it's interesting how much the community really, from the beginning, defined itself as an intellectual community. And I think it's still very true today that science fiction, people pride themselves on the breadth of their reading and writing. And most of the authors I know do work even today in multiple genres. In fact, Kim Stanley Robinson once told me the best thing he could do for his science fiction writing was to read Sanskrit poetry every night, because it was just so different. And creativity comes out of oppositions and contrasts.
Claro, ya que Miguel Ángel ha sacado
Yes, you mentioned Lake Brackett. I know that you love the Lake Brackett's piece and all her work, and that piece shows how these women were not just concerned about feminism and femininity, but they were using that space to fight for very important aspects. Lake Brackett's piece is against racism.
Yes, there's actually a quite long tradition in the science fiction community of politically active women who worked both in feminism and then in other areas, and often working with Black Americans and working on civil rights, which makes sense because when marginalized communities come together, their voices amplify more. And there was a whole subgenre of stories in the white science fiction community in the 40s and 50s that were very much pro-civil rights and pro-integration stories. And again, it was a great place to write about this in a time when it was difficult to do so, because if you write about the blue aliens of Pluto oppressing the green turtles of Mars, that's not about us, is it? No, couldn't be, right? So I think that's no surprise that you see that. The one thing I found that's interesting is I've recently been doing research in the Black historic newspapers, and there's a whole tradition of both men and women writing those same kinds of science fiction stories there. So, yeah, it was absolutely, I think, a period where you can see marginalized authors starting to connect with each other in ways that continue today.
Y dentro de la comunidad.
And within the community, I don't know if we can talk about fandom at that time, whether we could use that term. How were they received among readers, those writers?
science fiction readers are every bit as diverse as every other group of people, and they had mixed reactions. Overall, people really, they were fine with this and happy to have women writing new kinds of stories. And you see, especially in the early magazines, often young men, and old men and all kinds of men would write in and they'd say, where are the women? And the women are like, hi, we're right here. From the beginning, fans were looking they saw it as the future, and they wanted everyone to play in the field. Fans also wondered where the black authors were, for what it's worth. They were writing for other audiences, it turns out. But so overall, women were well embraced, and so I think that's why when women would write very overtly feminist stories, people were sort of shocked by it, because they're like, oh, this wasn't what she'd been writing before. But the editors loved it, especially the more controversial it was, the more it got fans arguing and talking, and the more it got people reading things. So that was great. By the time you get to the 50s, you do start to have a small but large group of fans who are speaking out, especially against domestic science fiction, which many of them just didn't feel had a place in science fiction. It was a small but loud minority who made these claims, and they would call it heartthrob and diaper fiction and be very dismissive of it. But some women, like Anne McCaffrey, just decided to lean into that and say, oh, you don't like it? Then I'm going to write more of it for you. Like I said, most people, though, thought it was exciting, and we even had men who were writing domestic science fiction. So often under women's pseudonyms, because you couldn't do it otherwise. It wasn't a manly thing to do. But they did.
Y luego tenemos...
And then in the 1960s, we have the emergence of feminist science fiction, a type of science fiction that tries to use that genre to present the topics and the reflections and the ideas in a much more direct way, more straightforward, and addressing all the topics about gender in a way that is that I think turned science fiction into a genre that allowed them to present things that were more complex to discuss. Perhaps for other genres it could be more difficult.
I think that science fiction was a good home for feminist writing, especially in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of women who started their careers at that time have really positive things to say about their reception and how supportive most men were. There was a small and vocal, once again, group who didn't like feminist science fiction, who thought too much interiority was happening, too much exploration of non-scientific issues, and maybe this wasn't really science fiction at all, and they didn't like it. But what's funny is, in the long run, most of those men who were very vocal about their dislike of feminist science fiction came around, and when you read their work today, they absolutely are incorporating all the new character types and all the techniques that feminist science fiction authors brought to the genre. And I think I was just telling people earlier today, in fact, that one of those authors who's still alive today, who was very vocal back in the 60s and 70s about women have no place here, this feminist science fiction, I don't think it's a good idea. And now he's very, very old and very passionate about women's places in the community. And we went to dinner once, and another man in the group had said something about how, there weren't really women in science fiction until recently. And this gentleman just schooled him in it and was like, oh no, let me tell you about what happened in the 60s and 70s, and retold that whole story. And I just thought that was really amazing.
Sí, pero coincide además con
Yes, but it coincides with that time when James Ballard, for example, speaks about the fact that science fiction should now address the inner world after everything that they have done. So it fits perfectly well with that perspective.
Right, and also that was a time when science fiction became very experimental and very avant-garde, and that was another thing that I understand really brought women into the genre, because for the first time they could bring all of these tricks and traditions from other kinds of women's writing with them into science fiction.
Ya que estáis con esa ciencia ficción de finales de los años
since the beginning of the 60s, we see some issues in these pieces that are still very common nowadays. For example, related to our body or how women look. And when you read, I don't know if you've seen the movie, The Substance, La Sustancia, it's a movie that was just premiered with Demi Moore, and it talks about what technology needs to do with your body so you feel prettier and younger. And so it's something so common nowadays. It's the Instagram filters.
One of the reasons that these stories have been so well received by people of all ages and around the world is because the issues that these women are identifying, especially in the 60s and 70s, are issues that we're still really grappling with today and in many ways coming back to and revisiting for better and for worse. So yeah, it's no surprise that this, even my students read this and they're like, was this written yesterday? They don't see it as old fiction. It feels very contemporary to them.
Sí, porque este y Cariño estuviste genial son ejemplos.
Yes, because this is an example of how technology can oppress women. That's why we have that technologic terror addressed to women especially.
Yeah, and I haven't seen The Substance, but back in 2015, a movie came out called Advantageous by Jennifer Fong, and it was very much the same thing. It's about a woman who works for they're like a life extension and rejuvenation company, and they tell her that basically she'll be fired, and this is a world where you don't want to be fired, like, it's tough, unless she's willing to become the spokesperson for their treatments and essentially become a much younger, and I think a white woman as well. She's Asian, and so she has to really change. And she has a daughter, and it's, this is the drama of the story, is how much of this will help her daughter be financially stable and have a good life, and how much is she teaching her daughter really dangerous things by going through these processes.
Sí, de hecho, esos dos relatos que
In fact, those two stories that were mentioned by Marta could be two chapters of Black Mirror perfectly well. They wouldn't even need any adaptation. You could just put them in, and they would even be better than some of the chapters in Black Mirror. But anyway, above all, in spite of the fact that label of domestic science fiction is created, anyone that reads science fiction knows that it is a genre with lots of sub-genres, and they dare to address every genre. I don't remember right now. You mentioned an author, a female author that does a list, that creates a list of the genres, all the topics of science fiction. That is amazing, because those are the topics that are dealt with by science fiction nowadays, and they touch all of them. Their interest is very comprehensive, universal.
Right, so not only did women help pioneer science fiction, but they wrote the first piece of science fiction criticism as well, right? This is Claire Winger Harris, and she was the first woman to publish in the pulp science fiction magazines, and she wrote frequently in the letters pages as well, and that's where she started to mark out, like, what were the most important kinds of science fiction stories to tell. And it's true, we do tell most of them still today, which is amazing. Although there were one or two types in her list we don't do, and I'm trying to remember what they were. It might be the giant man-eating bug stories. We don't do as many of those, I think, anymore, although perhaps we should.
y no sé si es por la selección que has hecho.
And I don't know, perhaps it's the selection that you have made, or perhaps this is my own point of view, and you may not share it with me, but is it possible that there is more humor without being tales about humor, but there are some irony and some humor here and there, perhaps above the average of what you can find in science fiction by men? I'm not talking about humor tales as such, but there's a touch, there's a twist there that has some irony that is really very much appreciated.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because when you're not at the center of your culture, you have a couple different options. You can go into despair, or you can laugh and then try to do something about it, right? And one of the great ways we overcome our sense of alienation and disconnection is by creating art. So I think it's no surprise you see women creating art, but art that has that kind of, sometimes it is actually sort of funny. I think A Conquest of Gola is actually a pretty funny story. Because it's always funny when aliens beat the humans, right? But it is. And the aliens are so vain, they're very funny, and they're actually very sexist in their own way, and it's quite delightful. And now I've lost track of the question.
No has perdido.
No, that was precisely what I was asking. For example, you have some of them. We are not going to say which one. You call them in an interview. You call them the zeros, so like zeros instead of heroines that save them. But the tone is like, okay, we are going to save you. So. Compared to the male hero, which is quite impulsive and quite impressive, they are a different type of heroine. They have a different look, and they don't really, they are not so arrogant. They are just a little bit ironic there, that we are going to solve and to fix what these people have done. And that is quite a striking point of view, because what is common there is the one man, a hero, very impressive, very very robust, and the heroines that you talk about, the one that I was telling, the Einst one, she has a different look. Is a heroine in spite of herself, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it's true, right? And we often talk about them as sheroes, right, rather than heroes. And sheroes go on a different journey than heroes do. The hero's journey is often a journey of separation. You separate from the family, you separate from the earth, and you show your mastery over those things, and that's how you become a hero. Whereas often sheroes, perhaps because women have often had men try to exert mastery over them, tend to think about heroism differently, and it's much more about reconnecting with families and communities and with the earth, and drawing power and strength from that. So we see that in the C.L. Moore story with in Black God's Kiss with Joelle of Jory, who was the first, she was the answer to Conan the Barbarian. That was always the plan, and she is in some ways very traditionally heroic until she realizes that's not going to work, right? And that's often the journey, I think, for the shero, is she starts with the model she has, which is the male heroic model, and then realizes that's not going to work, and that she needs to switch to and that's her growth, is to switch to a different model. But then there's also the much quieter heroines of domestic science fiction who don't look like heroines, right? They don't wear spandex, they're not on rocket ships, and it's not necessarily a gigantic, dramatic saving of all humanity, but it's the much smaller but more important kinds of fighting for the future that we do every single day as we negotiate each other and everyday life.
Y hay algo que me...
And there is something that I like very much, and that is that the first authors, the first female authors, when you tell how they discover science fiction and become fond of it, they read mainly Burroughs and the Mars cycle stories and the Mars Princess and so on. And the last ones read also that, but they read the pioneers, the ones that we read at the beginning. I think that is really very emotional, how that line is created that joins all of them together.
Yeah, it is, isn't it nice? And I love the fact that, right, while many of the first women are engaging and reacting to not just Burroughs, but H.G. Wells and Edgar Allan Poe, they're also, though, drawing on women's traditions of writing. And let's not forget, women were some of the first popular novelists. The concept of the best-selling novel was created by a woman writer who did fantastically well. So, and we see this, for instance, in the kinds of male characters that they'll bring in. The men are never interested in the women for their beauty, but for their brains. They're often smart men themselves, not necessarily very dominant Flash Gordon types. So I think it is exciting, and then you're right, to begin to see the next generation have women that they can read and engage as well as men is a wonderful thing to find out. And we're learning even more about that now, that some of the women I've written about in these books, actually there were an earlier generation of women writers, and they were probably emulating them as well in the science fiction magazines. So the story keeps getting deeper, and we can make these genealogies even more complicated and rich.
Sí, y creo que tú cumples.
And I believe that you also play a very important role with books such as this one.
Thanks. I hope so.
Tenemos unos micrófonos en la sala.
We have some microphones in the room if any of you want to ask any questions. Since we are all Trekkies here, you can just raise your hand like this and we will hand you the microphone. You can ask Lisa Yaszek whatever you want. While you think about your questions, I want to ask her something else, because I don't want to leave the room without talking also about sex, because women also opened that conversation, right? There were Martians that were really hot. Really hot. And they also talked about different things. They talked about genders and the lack of gender definition. They also opened the way for queer authors so they could express themselves.
I think that's true. So yes, let's end by talking about sex always, right? It's true. The early science fiction community, one of the ways that as science fiction defined itself as a genre in opposition to the other popular genres was by keeping the romance to a minimum and the sex to a minimum. And in fact, a very, very young Isaac Asimov at the age of 16 wrote into Amazing Stories and said, in fact, there should never even be a single kiss in science fiction. We have no need for any of this. And if you've ever read his biography, he remembered that, and he said, this is why I didn't go on a date till I was 29. And yeah, so I think that, and often, right, like sex somehow then would get elided with women, and somehow that would seem to mean there should never be women in science fiction. So women said, yeah, we should be in there, and sex should probably be in there as well. And that's one of the things I find so amazing, is that women are writing about sexuality, but at every period of their lives, especially once we get to the 60s and 70s, everything from a girl getting her first period to a young woman getting married, to a middle-aged woman maybe reassessing her life, to menopausal aliens who are going through sainthood. And it's just such a wide variety. And that's one of my favorite things about these stories, is the diversity of women who are represented in a genre that is very flat often, right, where characters are vehicles for ideas rather than emotions or intellectual processes. Women brought that kind of complexity, and doing it through thinking about sexuality makes sense, because again, like, it's something most of us have, and insofar as sometimes sex produces children, it builds the future, right?
¿Queréis preguntar algo?
Do you want to ask anything? We have a question back there in the back row. Hello, thank you very much for everything. It's been spectacular. I don't know if I should ask the question in English or Spanish. Well, Lisa.
Really, really interesting, everything you've said. And, well, I'll make the question in English and then I'll translate it in Spanish. But my question is, I'm a really fan of dystopian genre. So But when you read the old classics like We from Samyang or 1984 or A Brave New World, I think there's this sense of hopelessness. You know, like it's always the power that destroys the human being, you know, or that you give up to power. So my question is, when you have studying and you have read this women writing science fiction, how they talk about hope? Like what place does hope have in their literature? Because for me it's really interesting.
That's a great question. Women who did write dystopian fiction much like men did. The most important example I can think of is Catherine Burdekin's Swastika Night from 1938, which obviously is extrapolating from the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany to imagine this really dystopian future, especially for women. And if I remember correctly, there's no way out on that one. It's a pretty bleak book. But by the time you get to the 1940s and 50s, and we're starting to see really nuclear war narratives and a lot of dystopian stories around that, actually women's stories, well, sometimes they're really hopeless. There's definitely some of those. But some of them are more hopeful, and the hope again tends to lie in community, and the hope is really that women and scientists and maybe young people will pair together, will join up to fight the forces of irrationality and evil. And then again, the hero is the community, right? It's about communal action and communal resistance.
Mira qué bien que está justo al lado.
Oh, right there, next to the previous question. My question is much easier.
My question is much simpler. Now that we have the three books, I understand that they are three independent stories. And can you suggest an order for reading them, your books? Or is there an order or not?
Oh, is there another book coming out in the series? Is that what you're asking?
No, an order to read them, a sequence.
Compro los tres libros por...
You could read them in any sequence you wanted. One of the things I really was delighted about was the way they were broken up. When I originally published this, it was as a single book, and I hadn't thought about breaking it up into the kind of themes that Almadía broke it up into, but I found that very exciting, and it's made the stories new for me again, to see them put together differently. So I would say read them in whatever order catches your fancy, whichever book cover maybe seems the most exciting, whatever group of themes that you enjoy the most, and then see where that takes you. I think any way to read that, it would be fun.
Creo que nosotros somos ejemplo de esto que has preguntado.
Sí. Lo único, quizá...
Yeah, the only thing, perhaps if you allow me, is that this one, which is the first one, has the general introduction by Lisa that can serve as a guide, but it is not a problem to take any of them and read them.
¿Llevas los tres?
No, and it's just great. You just buy the three of them and you take them all together. Miguel Ángel read them, not in... I mean, one after the other, but I'm very structured, so I read them, the first one, then the second one, then the last one, and we all enjoyed it.
It is like those books that existed where you can build your own adventure.
Yes, exactly, right. You choose the direction you want to take it in. And in fact, I love the idea of, even within the book, read the stories out of order, right? And read them frequently in different settings, at different times of the day, when you're in a different state of mind, when you're sober, when you've been drinking, when you've had a good meal, after a good night's sleep, after a bad night's sleep, right? Because you'll get something different out of them from each time. And that was something we really wanted with this, was to pick the stories that were the most like finely polished gems, that had lots of different angles and lots of different ways to approach them, so that they were stories you could return to time and time again.
Miguel Ángel, creo que no podemos irnos y pensando alguna pregunta.
Miguel Angel, we cannot live without talking about our favorite story, The Tunnel Ahead. You've read it, and you told me that you enjoyed it even more when you read it as part of these volumes.
Yes, it is a story that I already knew because, as she said, it has been incorporated into anthologies many times. And I have to confess that I read it long ago, and I didn't remember that it was written by a woman. I didn't even remember who wrote it. But for me, finding it again in this book, in your selection, and being able to really locate it precisely has been wonderful. But it's a story that I read when I was an adolescent in an anthology like the Golden Age of Science Fiction, those anthologies that were published, and finding it again, it was a surprise for me. And I remembered those times, and I continue to think that it is incredible. It is as incredible as it was the first time I read it.
It's so important that you didn't even realize you were reading a woman writer the first time, because while many of these stories definitely have feminine concerns at the center and strong feminine presences within them, women really did write all the same kinds of stories as men, in addition to adding new things to the genre. So I think it's no surprise that some of these stories could have been written by someone of any gender, and I think that's a good thing, because again it points to the diversity and the flexibility of women's writing.
Sí, de hecho me ocurrió con varias que incluyes.
Yeah, in fact, it happened to me with several of them. So in the anthology of Dangerous something by Carlton Ellis, I didn't have that classification of men, women. It was not so well structured. And perhaps I thought that they were all men. I don't know. Perhaps I had some prejudice there. But it's true. I don't want to take any more time.
No, I grew up reading the Harlan Ellison anthologies as well, and I can see what you're saying, although I had a different experience of them. I really honed in on the women writers and well, there were a few writers of color, but like Samuel Delany, who also is a feminist as well. And in fact, my family, I grew up, as you know, reading science fiction. My whole family reads it. And my family loved the experimental writers. So I grew up reading Joanna Russ and Vonda McIntyre and Samuel Delany and James Tiptree. I was shocked when I realized that most of the science fiction community was white men. I was like, really? This doesn't look like what I read. But so that was surprising for me. And I wonder if that early experience isn't part of what shaped the way I wanted to do these books.
Pues nos quedamos más o menos en la misma zona.
Another question over there?
What would you recommend for a person who would like to someday write science fiction, like work of art or something? What would you recommend that person to start doing, like a great advice or something?
I would tell you to start writing, and I would tell you to find a group to write with, right? I feel that I see this a lot with my students, that students I have a lot of students who want to write, and when they write in isolation, you can get a lot done, but it's often difficult for other people to read it because you're not getting feedback and you're not having people talk to you about, like, well, how does this fit with this kind of storytelling, or maybe you'd want to try this technique. So my advice for you would be, first of all, start writing. Write now, do it all the time, 5 minutes a day, if that's what gets you going. And then the next thing is to find a group who will support you, but also give you good feedback on what needs to happen. And it might be a group of young writers like you who are all just learning your craft, or perhaps if you know any science fiction writers, you could ask one to mentor you. That's always very helpful as well. Sometimes scary, but helpful. But I think the important thing is to write and to make your writing public. Writing should not be, reading can be a private experience, but writing is not. We write to communities. And so the quicker you can get over being afraid to show your writing, and it's terrifying to show people your writing. I think all of you who do write know this. Like, it's tough. It is a private thing. It's your baby. And it's hard to show that to other people, especially if they tell you the baby's ugly. But you get better at it and you get used to it, and then you learn to appreciate that kind of feedback. And that's really the best thing I can tell you. Also, just send stories out, start sending things out to magazines you admire. Probably you'll just get rejected and really quickly, but maybe not. And maybe you'll get, sometimes an editor, an editorial assistant will be like, well, we don't want this, but this other magazine would be perfect for you. So building those networks right away, very important, I think.
Ay, ojalá nazca de aquí un grupo de jóvenes.
Oh, yeah, I hope we would get a new group of young science fiction writers. You're going to be their spokesperson because of asking this question here. Now we have another question over there. Thank you. Hello, thank you very much for your words here today. I would like to know whether you consider that nowadays there's a group of women that are coming after all these authors that we had in the past, and which names or which authors would you recommend? Thank you.
So many. So one of my favorite up-and-coming authors, who many of you may not have heard of yet, is she's named Bethany Jacobs, and she writes space opera. We were just talking about how many women write space opera these days. And I'm now completely forgetting the name of her novel, and I just taught it. But Bethany Jacobs, remember her name. Her second novel just came out. I think they're wonderful books. They're so big and they're very exciting, but also complex and great characterization, like really great characterization. Like there's a character you hate all the way through, and then something happens that changes everything for you. But you also love to hate her, so it's very exciting. And I have to admit, Bethany was actually one of I mentored her when she was at Georgia Tech. So another reason I love her stuff, but she's winning awards. She's really becoming very popular right now, so I highly recommend her work. Another author I like is a Nigerian author who's currently living in Toronto. And her name is Chinelo Onwualu. And she runs one of the first Pan-African science fiction magazines. And she works primarily in the short story form at this point. It's very literary, and I love her writing because it's really a wonderful blend of Western science fiction, Nigerian high literary traditions. She's really good with puns. This is something I often find in Nigerian literature, just really exuberant linguistic play. And also brings a really interesting global South kind of feminist sensibility to her writing that's different than what I'm used to as a northern white woman. So I think her writing is just amazing. I could keep going. Oh, good. Someone else is going. Otherwise, I'll give recommendations forever.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Hi, good afternoon. I wanted to ask, I understand that the authors are from the US, or at least they write in English. And I wanted to know whether this same piece of research into the past, whether it has taken place also in other countries, in other languages.
I've worked historically mostly with American authors, in part because my graduate school training is in American literature and culture, and that is what I know. And also in part because the modern science fiction tradition, at least commercial magazine tradition, is associated with the United States. So my own research has gone in that direction. Having said that, absolutely, other people are beginning to do this work now for other countries. And in fact, I was inspired by Cherie Renee Thomas, who's an African-American author and anthologist who had been recovering African-American in science fiction. And that was part of what inspired me to start doing this work. So we see that, and also within the US, we see people recovering indigenous traditions of science fiction. But also, we're beginning to see this across the globe, and the most exciting one to me is there's another good author to recommend, Regina Kanyu Wong from Singapore, currently studying in Oslo. She's a remarkable writer. She's pursuing her PhD. She's a well-known science fiction writer, but she's actually doing her work on the recovery of Chinese women in science fiction. And what she's finding is that while historically there weren't a lot of women women writers in China, that the magazines behind the scenes were staffed almost exclusively by women, and they had a great deal of control over shaping what the genre ended up looking like. So keep your eyes out for that book. I think it's going to be really amazing, and I'm excited to learn about a very different science fiction history.
Por cierto, que con esto que pregunta.
Actually, with you were saying before, talking about the research, the languages, Miguel Ángel was also telling us something that was very interesting. I didn't know about it.
Yes, in fact, she was included in an anthology, the dystopian anthology, that was published 2 or 3 years ago. It is not the topic we are dealing with right now, but the question is that science fiction and fantasy in Spain, in the country of Quixote, science fiction has not been appreciated, and it has been considered that writing fantasy or science fiction was not serious. But Emilia Pardo Bazán, who is an author that is really a person that was very much interested in science, and she was very up to date, and she has what we could today call science fiction. And I'm sure that there's a whole work that there are researchers that are starting to dig into that. But the problem that we have in Spain is that unlike the United States, where in spite of the fact that science fiction could be considered a pulp genre, there is a recognition, there is an acknowledgement. Authors such as Isaac Asimov is a very important author, or Hayden, or I'm also thinking about Margaret Atwood. They are very well considered, and they can write a science fiction, and there's no problem at all. In Spain, that is not the case. And there are people who write wonderful science fiction, but we continue to get with the academy. The academy is always there, but I don't want to take any time from Lisa's presentation. But we have different layers. In order to reach the women that write science fiction, we should perhaps address authors that write science fiction. We are in a country where there is nothing of that. If it had been written in another country, it would have been a classical of science fiction.
Well, I was going to say, science wasn't always taken seriously in America. In the 20s and 30s and 40s, it was actually seen as a really disreputable genre. And in fact, because some of the covers were a little bit, especially for weird tales for the horror magazines, the covers could get a little spicy. You might have like a giant robot threatening a naked woman, or a giant naked woman threatening a man, or something like that. But magazines, the science fiction magazines, got classified as pornography and had to be sold under the counter sometimes. Yeah, so, but that changed after World War II, right? Because the New York Times wrote about this. The New York Times was like, well, we used to laugh at all these authors for writing about crazy things like atomic power and rocket ships and computers, but now, and this is a quote from the New York Times, they said, they've been proven to be prophets, their prophets proven right by the course of events, right? So I think the minute that reality caught up to science fiction's imaginations, suddenly people saw these as authors with their pulse on the moment. And this is the moment when science fiction authors in America are beginning to be invited to be consultants in Hollywood, in corporations, and in the government. So absolutely start to take it seriously at that point.
Sin embargo, todavía tenemos casos como...
However, we still have cases, and Marta knows, and I always mention it because it is incredible. Ewan McEwan launches a science fiction novel that he says that no, this is not a science fiction because it is going to be considered something that he doesn't want. But that was, I was really outraged at that. We continue to have that problem with science fiction in spite of all.
Absolutely, right. I think Margaret Atwood is another really good example of this. I mean, she wrote The Handmaid's Tale. It's certainly one of the most constantly remade and talked about books, but to this day, she barely admits she even writes fantastic fiction. That was true of other American authors like Thomas Pynchon and Kurt Vonnegut, right? And that very much came out of a specific time period, out of the 50s and 60s, and that was a moment when agents and marketing people really believed you had to choose either between genre writing or mainstream writing, and you couldn't really mix the two. So you saw people like Vonnegut and Pynchon literally pulling away from the science fiction community. They would refuse awards. They want no contact with the community. And like I said, Margaret Atwood still doesn't want to admit she writes science fiction. I think she finally admitted she writes speculative fiction, right? So a little bit of a difference. It sounds fancier, right, in English at least. So, but today, there's a lot less of that. I'm surprised about Ian McEwan, but I don't know what to say.
Lo dijo, no es.
Yes, he said it is not science fiction. It is a novel about androids or robots, but it is a novel that was pure science fiction. It even it was a Uchronia, I think, and that's what he answered. No, because there are no spacecrafts. And you mentioned Thomas Pinchot, and the person that is just by your side in her biographic note, she always says that she's the ambassador of Thomas Pynchon in Spain. She's a great fan.
Yeah, Pynchon, que no seas tú.
It's great that someone mentions him here, not me myself. But the books that you need to buy today in the Antonio Machado Library bookstore is these 3 wonderful books published by Almadía. I don't know if we have any other questions, but if not now, when you ask her to sign the books you buy, you can maybe also ask her your questions. Why do you wait until the very last minute?
I will speak quick. I don't want you to spend a long time with it. What are the new interesting topics from what you are investigating or thinking about in order to promote different books with science fiction structure, but about I don't know, a peaceful world, the final wars, or really unusual scenes.
So you're asking me, like, what are the topics that authors are writing about right now?
What you would like to write about.
Oh, what I would like to write about next? I'm hoping to do another volume in this series. We've gotten to the 1960s. So the books that you all have are from my first book, which went from the 1920s to the 1960s. The second book is the 1970s and the rise of feminist science fiction. So we're hoping to continue going through the decades. So we're looking at either doing next the 1980s, which would mean cyberpunk, which is a lot of fun. Everyone still likes cyberpunk. Or we're thinking about taking a break from the decade, because we've been doing it decade by decade. And we're thinking about doing a break and doing instead a volume on reproductive justice and looking at the kinds of stories women have told about sex and childbearing and marriage and motherhood since the 1920s to the present.
Pues estamos deseando. En fin, señoras, señores, alienígenas.
Well, we can't wait. So, ladies, gentlemen, aliens, people from any dimension, it's been a pleasure. We want to thank you, Lisa, for being here today with us. Thank you for this compilation of works, and thank you for all the future work that you still have ahead. And Miguel Ángel, thank you very much as well.
Thank you also.
Gracias.
Yes, we're so thankful.
Yeah, and you for a wonderful conversation, and all of you for great questions and just being a great audience. So give yourself a round of applause, please.